All right, welcome everyone. Welcome and a very good afternoon if you're calling from the East Coast, Chicago in the case of Eli, and good morning for everyone that's on the West Coast dialing in today. We're super excited for hosting our second session of this topic. But before I give a little bit of an introduction on the topic itself, I'll give a super quick introduction about myself. My name is Bas Offers, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer at PX. And I have my good friend Eli Schwarz joining me for this call from Verisk/Jornaya, still the big reference to Jornaya, obviously. And we're going to take you guys today through a session as a follow-up from our session of about 2 weeks ago. We're going to do a big summary as well, what we discussed in session number 1. So we're going to take the time to do a quick recap. But today's session is similar in the format as the last time. We want to make sure that we're discussing the topic, obviously, around the proposed FCC, or actually approved FCC changes that are having a pretty large implication on how we're doing lead generation today in the industry, and in particular, the way how consent can be captured, which will be moving towards more of a one-to-one consent. Today's webinar, we're going to discuss a little bit more about what it really means in practice. What does it mean? What are the type of different flows that can be set up that are supporting this new regulation? Where do we see most of the industry shifting towards? So we're going to talk about the ideas that have been collected among all of our partners and clients on both sides, where we think everything is going to move towards to. And also about the way how both Verisk and PX can help make this as easy as possible. But before we do so, as I mentioned, we're going to look back as well in our session number 1. In terms of the theme, similar as last time, we want to make this as pragmatic, realistic, and facts versus opinions, as straightforward as possible. So we do not believe that this is the end of lead generation. The sky is not falling on lead generation. This is actually a tremendous opportunity as an industry, how we can level up to provide a better customer experience, but also to actually provide better ways of working together. And that's what we'll be focusing on in this particular session. We've not figured everything out from our end, so we love this session to be as interactive as we can make it. So please do participate. And in a second, we'll share how we can do that. Without further ado, let me share my screen and get this content kicked off, because we figured it would be the best way to walk through this. There's quite some content that we'll discuss today to showcase. Introduce ourselves. So let's get it kicked off. And Eli, I'm passing the torch to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Bas. And thank you, everybody, for joining us here today and taking time out of your schedule to be here. Thanks for coming back if this is your second time joining us, and welcome to those of you that are new to the dialogue and joining us for the first time. So today is going to be the second installment of what is a 3-part series we're running here. We're looking forward to diving into this. The topic here is really, I think, interesting from a personal perspective to me. I think also to Bas, given the kind of journey that we think our industry is about to go on, which looks very similar to what we experienced about 11 years ago when the TCPA regulation was updated in 2013, and that regulation update kind of set the stage for the way our entire ecosystem operates today. At the time, there was a lot of fear and uncertainty about how the industry would react and whether it would be the end of lead gen as we knew it. Ultimately, it played out, and we all were able to evolve and kind of adapt to the changes. So as Bas mentioned just a minute ago, our intent with this whole series is to kind of help bring practical solutions, facts to the table, help everyone understand what's happening, and demystify some of the concerns and the fears, ultimately to help the entire industry work through how we all need to prepare and plan for the future state that's ahead of us. So I think in just a minute, Bas is going to kind of recap session 1 for us. We kicked off with a session where we focused purely on the FCC's updates and trying to get clear on what they mean. We were joined by Michelle Schuster, and we got down to kind of the facts of of what's changing. For today, we're going to dive deeper into one-to-one brand consent specifically, and talk about what that means for the industry, and some examples around how we think brand specific consent will be created, and how to facilitate that utilizing new technology and capability. And then we'll have our the third part to this series coming up in just about a week here. We'll be joined by some additional experts in Matt Curtis and Gabe Allen, who will come speak to the specific ways they're approaching this problem from the brand's perspective, and the solutions they're putting in place to be ready for and to prepare for these changes well ahead of time. So with that, I think, Bas, if you'll jump to the next one, we can briefly touch on the agenda here. So we're going to do a quick summary of session one for those of you that weren't able to join us last time. Not a replacement for session one, so there was a lot of good detail covered, including in Q&A with a lot of input from Michelle Schuster. So I would encourage you to go back and actually watch the recording if you missed that to get the full story. But we'll hit the headlines so that you have context for what we're covering today. And then we'll dive into the core of this discussion, which is really focused on how we see the future evolving with one-to-one brand explicit consent. And we'll go through specific examples of lead flows, website lead flows, as well as kind of the back end of what's happening behind the scenes to facilitate those lead flows. We'll talk through how we see that evolving in preparation there, and the role that VMS and PX together can play in helping to support that. And then we'll close up with a discussion around some of the types of campaigns that support this one-to-one brand explicit consent. And then I think we'll move to Q&A from there. Well, just a quick reminder that we want to make this interactive, so please do use the Q&A chat function here. In our first session, we had dozens of questions coming in throughout. We were able to address a good amount of those, but not all of them in the live discussion. We'll try to cover as many as possible if you drop your questions into the chat. And then for any that we don't get to live, we'll try to also circle back to you offline with answers wherever we can after this.
Awesome. I'll provide a quick summary of session number one. And before I do so, I just wanted to express indeed that the recording is available, session number one. So we send out some emails, but also readily available through both of our websites. And secondly, just the excitement about how many registrants we had since the last session number one. We had quite a couple of hundred people that were added. So we're well above 1,000 people that registered for the event. So we're super stoked that hopefully we're going to say some interesting stuff to share with all of you. In terms of session number one, we talked about the fact that Michelle Schuster came on and really walked us through somewhat of the history of TCPA and what obviously the changes are in terms of where we are today and what we should be expecting with these new FCC regulations. And I think we have 2 or 3 slides that really summarize the majority of everything that's discussed. This slide discusses the summary of where we are today in terms of the changes, and there's actually 2 added bullet points since our last meeting. I think for the majority of the people that are on this call today know that the FCC, with their latest regulations in December, approved the changes that were discussed. But it's been something that was in the making for quite some time, and I think many in the industry for 6 to 9 months or so were already working together to address what was coming up. And what was coming up is the death of the hyperlinks in TCPA. We're going to move away from using TCPA disclosures with long lists of companies hyperlinked in the disclosure. I think for most of the call joining on this call today, that's nothing news, and a big one that's changing it, obviously, where the consumer will need to provide one-to-one consent. And the one-to-one consent means that the consumer literally needs to express affirmatively if they want to be contacted by by brands using an ATDS, text messages or pre-recorded messages. And we spoke a lot about what it means to actually contact through such means with prior express written consent, and also what it doesn't mean. There's quite some interesting discussions happening in the industry today. What's the definition of an ATDS, and is my dialer actually requiring the one-to-one consent? Next to that, what's very important to be aware of is that the actual consent that needs to be provided by the consumer needs to be logically and topically, meaning that the website where the content is about, or the actual lead form that if you're requesting a quote as a consumer in an auto insurance lead form, that you cannot cross-sell this to other products that are not logically or topically related. And for some companies in the industry, that's definitely a pretty big change on how leads are either being generated or acquired. But lastly, we spoke a lot about the fact when actually one-to-one consent might not be needed, and where you can actually continue to contact consumers when not using the ATDS text message or pre-recorded message, where not many changes prevail. So I would definitely recommend to look back the recording on that particular topic, because I think there was a lot of interestingness on there. Now, side note, the side note is that today in 2015, the Supreme Court put a definition out on what an ATDS means and what that is today. But there are some movements in the industry, in particular, a bill that's being proposed by Frank Pallone, Congressman of the state of New Jersey, to make changes on that definition. And I think that's something that everyone is following closely to see if the ATDS definition changes. That might mean that suddenly a one-to-one consent will be required in all instances of contacting the consumer. Last thing that's new since our last session is that the date of when everything needs to be live is known, which is January 27th, 2025. At that point of time, one-to-one consent is required, and it gives us all the time, obviously, to prepare on that for the next 12 months or so.
All right. So just to kind of simplify and clarify down what's changing from current state to future state with this update. Primarily, we have this distinction between current state, where prior express written consent is the standard requirement, with that shifting to, in the future state, needing one-to-one brand name prior express written consent. So if today you're gathering prior express written consent, but it's not specific to an individual named company in that disclosure, tomorrow with the updated regulation, you'll need to actually list one specific brand that consent is being obtained for. Related to that, as Bas noted earlier, in our current state, we have a lot of websites that operate with hyperlinks in their TCPA disclosures. So, when they're gathering consent, they'll put a hyperlink directly in there that links out to marketing partners that consent is being gathered for. So instead of naming the company in the disclosure, you link out to a list of many different companies, sometimes hundreds of companies that may call the consumer. That practice is no longer going to comply or be compliant, with the new update here. So it will be necessary to actually have one-to-one brand consent with the brand listed in that disclosure instead of using those hyperlinks. And I think, Bas, you touched on the dynamic here with an ATDS versus manual dialing. That distinction isn't necessarily changing with this regulation, right? As long as if you're currently operating with prior express written consent and treating that as your standard, that's shifting to one-to-one consent here. But if you're able to avoid that requirement with an ATDS as your strategy, there's nothing that's changed yet regarding that designation, but we want to make sure we're kind of closely watching that and seeing if that definition changes, because if it does, it could lead to the requirement for one-to-one consent being even more ubiquitous across the entire industry and all leads being generated. So, and I guess the final point here is from the consumer's perspective, what what's intended to change with this regulation is that the consumer will actually know who's going to contact them explicitly. So in the current state, right, with a link out to many different possible partners calling, the consumer doesn't always know, who's going to be dialing them when they give their TCPA consent on that website. The goal here from the FCC's perspective is to make sure that the consumer actually knows specifically which brands are going to call them and that they're consenting to each of those brands as a part of that consumer experience. And so a couple dynamics here that we're going to, I think, spend more time getting into in this session around things that we think are likely to change and our expectations for kind of what the future holds, right? And this is where we start to step into our view and our opinion of, of what's coming and how we think, the industry will evolve outside of just what the FCC has said and what's been stated in the regulation. So we're expecting to see a lot of innovation around what type of consumer experience publishers are able to create that gather this one-to-one brand consent. We're going to go through a few examples here in this session, but there are others out there, and expect that to continually evolve as everyone tries to figure out the right way to gather the consumer's consent, but also optimize for conversion and and monetization of lead flows. We think we're going to see less generic lead forms and lead flows and more exclusive campaigns, more multi-brand workflows where consumers are being matched to different brands, and then the experience is being tailored to that brand in order to complete that lead flow, versus the current state where it's often unbranded, kind of a generic experience specific to the product, or even not specific to the product, and multi-product line leads that are being generated. One additional area that we'll talk more about specific to the disclosures and the way kind of consent disclosures operate in our industry, there's a strong likelihood here that we all are able to actually simplify what end brands and buyers consider to be approved TCPA language. In the current state, most brands operate with various different iterations of the words in those consent statements that publishers and lead sellers are approved to use on their behalf when consent is gathered. With this shift to one-to-one brand consent, there's an opportunity for brands to have one single approved consent statement that their team has looked at and agreed upon, and that a seller or a publisher is able to take and use that single disclosure anytime they're gathering consent specifically for that brand. So we'll talk about that. That has potential to kind of improve the efficiency across the entire space as that shift goes into place. And then we're expecting more transparency and centralized management of vendors by buyers who have to make sure that their brand name was listed and that consent was gathered specific to their brand. Another opportunity to kind of drive more transparency down the line in how publishers and brands ultimately connect to benefit the consumer. And then I think this last point again speaks back to the definition of the ATDS, and I think we will probably see more brands and buyers attempting to figure out if they can they can classify their tech systems as not being an ATDS and manual dialing, and incorporating the DNC checks and state level checks to adhere to those requirements without needing to be classified under this requirement for gathering prior express written consent. So more to come as we dig into that one.
Awesome. We have quite a lot of questions coming in at this point of time, and I'll try to share them also with Eli in the meantime, so we can make sure that we address them where we see fit. I saw one particular question that I wanted to answer, which was about who actually needs to be listed as the brand to the consumer in the flows that we're going to discuss. We're going to obviously, as a next step, show some of the different flows. And I think that's a good question before we go into those flows to make sure that that's crystal clear. It needs to be the brand that's contacting the consumer with their offerings of goods or services. So that cannot be the broker if there's a facilitator or an intermediary in between, that bought the lead. That really needs to be the person that actually, or the company that really needs to have the consent to DAO on a one-to-one basis or contact the consumer on a one-to-one basis. And that's important. And that's we'll talk a little bit about what the implications are for leads that are today traveling through intermediaries. Before we do so, I think this is the time where we actually dive in a little bit in terms of the different workflows. We identified three main possible flows that lead forms can adhere to in order to adhere to brand explicit consent. And we'll refer to brand explicit consent because we think it cannot be clearer than mentioning it in that particular way, that the consumer is actually giving an explicit consent on a brand basis. And we've identified three flows. Now, these flows are where we believe most companies will focus on in terms of build outs. We believe, based on many discussions in the last couple months, that many companies are actually already focusing on this, and there's many companies that are testing these out today. But we'll walk through this. And what I think is important to keep in mind is that there's different alterations possible, combinations between the three as well. But I think these are the most important ones. So before I do that, let me actually try to switch my screen share to the way we can actually walk through the particular flows the easiest way. And the ways how we can do that is by walking through, first of all, the most simplistic way of generating a brand explicit consent, and that's through generating an exclusive lead. This particular flow shows an example of that. And again, there's different alterations possible, but I'm going to walk through the 4 different steps that have been outlined on the website. And we're happy to share, obviously, the link so you can actually play around with some of these flows afterwards to understand what it means. Well, a lead form in the basis of capturing all the data in the beginning or middle stages of the lead form won't change that much. The consumer will go through a funnel where they provide information about the product and service they're requesting. In this case, it could be an electricity provider or a solar panel. And along the way, information is obviously captured. Now, for an exclusive lead, a lead seller or a publisher can decide to show the fact that there's actually matches being retrieved. And we think that many companies will build this step in between, because most of the times, if you make this quite quick, it does not have a big conversion drop off. But secondly, what it does do, it gives the consumer the feeling and the ability, obviously, that selection has been made and that you're only being matched with a company that's able to serve you based on all the data being provided. And it's as simple as the next step, where that particular advertiser is then being shown in the disclosure. What happens in the backend, we'll go through in a second to show what we're doing. But what we're trying to show in this particular flow is that the best possible advertiser is being selected for the one-to-one consent. And that advertiser is being named in the TCPA disclosure, similar to how historically we've done hyperlinks to long TCPA company lists in the past. And with that, the consumer finalizes the opt-in with the disclosure for that particular company. And whatever cross-sell, whatever link out you do on the thank you page at that point of time, a lead is captured exclusively for that particular advertiser that's being mentioned. Again, we'll walk through a little bit of like what the workflows can be on the backend. And I think this is the most similar setup that most companies are operating under today, with the least amount of changes that is being implemented. The big change, however, is that only one advertiser is obviously being selected for the lead transaction. Now,
Hey,
the second, go ahead, Eli.
Yeah, just a question maybe or clarification on this one, right? So current state, we do see exclusive campaigns, right? Or leads that are generated to be exclusive for one brand in our industry today. Is it fair to say like a lot of those currently, the whole experience would be branded and it's intended to be exclusive to one brand from the start, whereas in what you just walked through, the consumer's entering information, the publisher is then making a real-time decision with that data and trying to figure out who to then take the consumer through as an exclusive lead, instead of the kind of the full flow from landing on the site all the way to the end being branded or specific to one end buyer. Is that a fair way to think about that?
100%. Yeah, 100%. And in this particular flow of the exclusive lead, what it really does, it still creates a big pool of potential buyers for that lead, potential advertisers that the consumer can be matched to. But based on the data that's being collected along the way, that best match is being done. The consumer is being matched with whoever can actually provide the best possible services. And I'm saying best possible services. I think we both know what probably lead sellers and lead providers would like to see is that actually the lead sells for the highest amount of dollars for that particular lead. So it's obviously depends on how that's being rank ordered. But if you think about all the different industries that were active in with all the people that are on this call as well, it's hard to generate a lead at all times that is fully branded. We'll talk a little bit more about the branded experience, but there's verticals that are very geographically focused or that are only tailored towards certain consumers based on the information that was obviously provided. So yes, to that, it's basically starting out in a particular vertical with the biggest possible net and then narrowing it down based on that data and selecting the best possible advertiser.
Gotcha. That's helpful. And I think an important call out you made to the price, right? Because the price of an exclusive lead in that flow has to be higher than what an individual shared lead would have been in the past in order to justify the publisher's workflow and the spend that they have to bring that consumer in and acquire them. So the more data they're able to gather about the consumer in that initial step, and the more they're able to kind of validate that it's going to be high quality for the end buyer to be willing to pay that higher price of exclusivity is going to be critical for that to work well.
100%, and that's a great bridge to scenario number 2, which is actually an alteration of the shared lead model as we know it today, and it's really a way for giving the consumer one-to-one consent in an affirmative way where the consumer is actually selecting these. So let me walk you through the flow. Similar flow, information is being captured along the way. Based on that information, matches are being searched for, are being queried, and as a next step, those matches are being shown. Now, this particular screenshot shows 3 companies that are being selected, where the consumer actually gave affirmative consent to be contacted on a one-to-one basis. By default, these cannot be all pre-selected. I'm not sure what the go about is for pre-selecting number 1 and then adding the other ones, but the consumer will need to select multiple providers, and once they select multiple providers, in this case 3 providers are being selected, that data is then being transacted as a share lead. And what you see here is that there's actually some custom texting, which at that stage, it could be decided that TCPA texts are all custom for all these 3 providers, or it could be that there is a joint TCPA on the bottom where once you select multiple providers, those providers are being added towards the TCPA. I think we're going to see different versions of that as well. That's number 2. And this is really the closest one in terms of where we are today as a shared lead model. And obviously there's combinations of scenario 1 and scenario 2 that are possible, where you start off by only selecting the company, the highest paying company or the best potential match company in the advertiser, and then as a next page select multi approach towards selecting multiple brands.
And Bas, just to make sure it's crystal clear on that last view, there's a TCPA disclosure consent statement underneath each provider, right? So utility provider 1, 2, 3, 4, they each have their own consent statement or language that would be inserted there specific to them, so making it one-to-one consent, right?
That is the most likely implementation that we're currently seeing, but it could be that based on these selections, these different utility provider brand names would be added to one unified disclosure that's at the bottom, and that adds the additional company names as well. I think overall that it's an opportunity for today to actually also allow brands to be in control of their TCPA text. I think there's a lot of different TCPA text floating around in the industry, and it's been challenging for lead publishers or lead providers for that matter to actually unify all the information that's required. So it could be a really good way, best practice way to give the brand the control to actually control whatever the TCPA text is that it's stating. But I think there's different alterations possible where that gets combined as well. So number 3, somewhat similar to scenario number 2, but slightly different. In this particular scenario, still the consumer goes to the flow, different matches are being queried. And at that point of time, you're opting into brand number 1. And it's a dedicated opt-in, one-page opt-in for each and every single brand. And what can be done after you opt in for brand number 1 is to actually stack these out and have different stacked brands behind each other, where you can either add on multiple requests. So really where you're starting out kind of like it as an exclusive lead with brand number 1, and the consumer can add different brands within that request. The benefit of this is that you can have somewhat of a combination of the exclusive lead to start with, but then break it out in a shared lead. As I mentioned, there's different alterations possible between these different 3 scenarios. We actually had a 4th scenario on the website earlier today, but we decided to simplify it and to focus on these 3. But these are really the main implementations that we see partners already actually testing with today. Any other add-ons from you, Eli, on these different flows?
I don't think so. Maybe just a note that that we see some of these already, right, in the industry today. These types of flows exist, especially the sequential pages. We've seen that before, and then also selecting multiple brands as a part of the lead submission. That's a practice that's been fairly common in particular in the education vertical for many years. So this is not all brand new, right? This type of experience exists, but it's the shift or the change to the brand specific name in that disclosure, and making this the common workflow instead of just one of many types of shared lead experiences is the shift. So I think we're going to kind of take a step back from that consumer experience and look at on the back end, like how do PX and VMS together kind of help support the back end of that workflow, and what are the different components of it that would be involved with ensuring it's compliant. If you want to jump to the next one here, Bas. So we've kind of broken down these 6 core areas or core components of the process that where the publisher and the brand kind of both need support from a technology perspective to pull this off. At the beginning of that process, right, there's the bidding and the matching that the publisher has to go through to determine the eligible brands. Then there's the process of actually showing an approved one-to-one consent statement and bringing that into the site experience. Then for the brand, there's the need to ensure and ultimately verify that their one-to-one consent was present. And then the publisher also needs to post and route the lead to the final buyer. The brand needs to be thinking about the campaign strategy based on the presence of one-to-one consent versus a different type of experience where they don't have that one-to-one brand consent, which might warrant a different follow-up strategy. And then across both the publisher and the brand, there's going to be a need and a desire to prove that the flow was compliant after the fact, if or when a consumer comes forward complaining, as we see today with the TCPA. So we'll step through kind of each of these areas as we go through the workflow. So breaking down what Bas showed us, but thinking about the back end of that process. In that first step, right, this is where the consumer's data is being collected, answers to lead form questions are being entered, and kind of the initial data gathering step. During that experience, the same way this operates in our current state, VMS technology would be present on that page and operating in the background, allowing us to collect and witness the experience that's occurring there. In that process, we issue our lead ID That's the token, Journaya token that gets associated with that event and then becomes the key to unlocking data later on in the experience. That next step that Bas stepped through is where the publisher actually needs to push data, in this case, into PX, who's helping to facilitate matching to those eligible brands. So they're trying to determine, which brand to match the consumer to and collect consent for. And that process involves posting the data into PX and then PX kind of running it through algorithms to help determine which brands should be matched and which ones are eligible, right, for that consumer, as well as helping the publisher figure out which disclosure language to actually insert and use given the match to specific brands. And then the third step here, once the consumer is actually providing their PII, they're actually giving consent to a specific brand disclosure and pressing that submit button. After that's occurred, there's another step here for the end buyer brand to run an API call over to VMS and verify that their brand approved consent statement disclosure was in fact present, shown to the consumer, and that they agreed to it before ultimately accepting that lead and dialing on it through their normal procedures. And then, of course, PX technology also is facilitating here the actual transaction and the routing of that final lead to get it from publisher to end brand buyer. Bas, is there anything you would add on this flow, or you want to clarify?
No, but I would add two particular questions that were raised. We're getting a lot of questions in the meantime, so I wanted to pull out two which I think are important to share. The first question was, is there a limit to how many providers we can surface? And I'm guessing that it's really in the relation of the amount of brands that the consumer can actually be selecting. In the way how the FCC is wording these regulations, there's no limit, and Michelle also confirmed that in the last session. There's no limit on how many brands a consumer can select and be matched with, which is somewhat different, I think, than the standard 4 to 5x max cap of sharing a lead within the industry. And the second one is a question around both scenario number 2 and scenario number 3, where it's supporting a shared lead by having the consumer explicitly select the checkbox in order to provide the consent. And the question is that actually still considered one-to-one consent? It is, in the way how it's being worded, and it's actually an affirmative selection or an affirmative action by the consumer to still do that one-to-one consent. So even it's called one-to-one, there can be multiple one-to-one consents being given on a completion of a lead form, which I think that's the important part that we wanted to share in this process, in the different scenarios where it does not need to be an exclusive lead, and we can actually give the consumer more control of who they're being matched with today, if done in a proper way, which complies. We jump to the next one for you, Eli.
Great. Yeah, so just breaking down the details a little further around the actual use of the consent statement and the way the technology would verify and ensure it was present in this workflow. So the brand or the end buyer would actually approve of the TCPA consent statement that they deem to be acceptable with their name included within it in advance. So they would operate that approved disclosure. They have a place where they come to kind of input that disclosure inside of our technology. And then in real time in this workflow, we would be comparing the language that was present on that website page. And so here you're seeing one of the ones from that flow that Bas stepped through. We'd be comparing that language to the language that was pre-approved by the brand. And all of that's happening within milliseconds in that API call to get this response back to validate whether the consumer saw that language and agreed to it or not, if they didn't see the same language and it wasn't approved. So that workflow would happen here. And this is where, I mentioned earlier, I think there's opportunity for brands to get down to a simplified set of what they approve of, where if these consent statements are always specific to one brand and being inserted dynamically into the site, it might mean that there's no real reason a brand needs to operate dozens of different approved language across different providers and different sources. They can have one statement that they've approved that everyone is utilizing dynamically when it's time to gather consent for that brand. I think there's more for us to work through all together there to see if that, if we're able to pull that off. But it does seem like opportunity for efficiency across the entire space.
There's a question about post rejects, how post rejects are actually being handled. We're going to address that in 2 or 3 slides from here, so I'm going to come back on that one. And another interesting question that was asked was, what would happen if the consumer chooses a brand that was a low bid on the lead? Would they still win the lead, or would it be a loss? And for example, brand A bids $40, brand B bids $30, but the consumer actually wants to work and get in contact with brand B, and they select brand B in that case. That's the beauty of these different scenarios and different flows that will be supported, I think, in many different combinations of the flows, where the publisher can actually really test out what's the best possible way to do so. Because if you give the consumer the option to do a selection, it could be that the first company that's on the highest end is actually generating a higher price for the publisher, would not be selected in terms of the first pick of a brand, and it could be that other brands are being selected. I think the question to pose with that is, what would have happened if that lead would have automatically gone to the 3 companies, and they did not want to be talking to the first one because they had a bad experience with that. So that is definitely a great question. It's something that we're starting to see many companies are starting to test with already today. And we don't have the ultimate answer which flow is the best. I think we're going to see a lot of different flows are working better in different types of traffic, high intent, lower intent, where push or pull strategy in terms of how the consumer is coming in, and what really is working the best possible way. The best part of all of this is that we have 12 months to figure out what some of these flows are yielding the best possible way, and that's obviously why we decided as well to get ahead of the problem and to make sure that we support that. Which brings me to the next slide, and I think this is where it's exciting, and this is also one of the reasons, obviously, that both Verisk and PX wanted to join forces together in these webinars and share our point of view, our thoughts on how we can address this the best possible way, because Verisk and PX are integrated today, and if leads are being transacted through PX, there's ways to actually do these verifications with Verisk marketing in an automated way, where such API calls are being made through PX, and where strategies can be set up in PX in order to decide as a brand what happens with the lead next. If there is a one-to-one consent, or there's a lack of a one-to-one consent, do I still want to buy that lead? Do I want to route that lead elsewhere with a different contact strategy, or is there something completely different that I want to do and actually buy that lead, inject it into my CRM, and contact that consumer at a later stage when my call center is not that busy? I think we're going to see a lot of different use cases being built out based on the fact that one-to-one consent was not there, because we don't think the industry for 100% will shift towards one-to-one consent. There will still be leads generated that won't have that particular way. So being able to support both possible setups is going to be key in there. And to talk a little bit, to round it up a little bit in terms of what some of the key changes are, I think it's clear within the flows that we've shown that the future state shows that the consent needs to be captured prior to completing the full lead form, prior to completing to where a lead is being matched on the back end. It needs to actually be happening on the publisher's form, on the lead generator's form, as part of the process. There's quite some questions coming in around the drop-off, if we can share any results on drop-offs. PX does not generate leads on our end. We help facilitate many publishers to do so. I think it would be a great case to share afterwards with some of the learnings that some of the companies have. So I'm definitely seeing a lot of interest in terms of what the different flows yield at. But there will be an impact in terms of how a consumer completes the form, and there will be a potential drop-off throughout that process. Now, the good thing about it is that these consumers are also expressing who they want to be matched with. So the likelihood of actually having higher contact rates, having higher close rates, is so much higher if the consumer is actually able to see the advertiser who they're being linked to, or they are deciding who they're being matched to by themselves. And I think that's exciting. That's exciting in the industry to actually focus on how can we get better high performing yields with these implications. So it's not all bad in terms of having these implementations being implemented. The last one, but the last one we discussed already, like where brands will definitely want to verify if that one-to-one explicit brand consent was available at the time of the opt-in. And Eli walked us through how that could be done. Couple thoughts, and I think there's more thoughts, especially based on all the amazing feedback that we're getting in, that we can add to this. And I think we should expand these slides and share the content afterwards as well. But a couple of thoughts. We believe that it's going to be important to pass brand names in a transparent way. Eli touched base on that already earlier in the beginning of the session. But to do it in a transparent way where if we're working with intermediaries, such as brokers, aggregators, agents in between, where those companies are being passed one-to-one, and not to make it a gray or black box and to hide those names. I don't think that serves everyone in what we're trying to achieve and how we want to level up some of these consumer experiences. The implication of that is that brand names will need to be standardized. We mentioned this already lastly, the last session, how that can be done. I know there's talks between many companies in the space, how the best possible way to standardizing it is. But simply put, we're going to need to not only pass brand names, but also pass a standardized ID for such brand names, so that the duplication of brand names that are spelled just slightly differently can be made. The most important things about all these different flows is that both Jornaya and PX will support various different ways on how to implement this. And I think it's not up to us to tell lead generators how to implement these new changes. I think we're going to see a lot of innovation. So we're going to make sure that we actually support this from different angles. We will be supporting a pre-ping where the matching can be done as a pre-ping, but also within the standard process of current ping post, or even the direct post setting, which we can touch base on later how that would look like. So we're going to try to make it as easy as possible and tailor towards the best possible ways in terms of when that particular matching needs to be done. Last one, and this is where I come back on the acceptance rate. I think that's a super interesting question. And I think a year ago, we put ourselves in a room with many companies in the industry, and we said, what are some of the major challenges that we face today that we should actually solve for, either technically, commercially, or differently? TCPA company list was definitely on the top of that. So I think this will be automatically being solved for with these new regulations. But secondly is the high rejection rates on particular leads. So what we want to do is make sure that we can support to fight that particular problem as well, and to make sure that a lead is being sold when a matching is being done. And the best possible way to do that is to do such a matching request based on either full name and email, or based on Jornaya lead ID at certain instances to ensure that consumer is unique and is not a duplication. And that can be done where the most standard duplication that we see in the industry today is where it's already a client, or where it's already a duplicate lead because that lead was acquired in the last 30 to 90 days. We want to make sure that will need to be solved in order to provide the best possible matching experience. And the best way to do that is actually to collect all the information up front and then do the matching. And when that's being done, the last point that I'll make, without sounding too salesy, is that if that's being done, it also gives the ability for partners to tap into all the retention campaigns that many brands are running today on PX's platform. Once we know of a consumer's name or through phone or email, if that consumer is already a client of a brand, we can help facilitate not only doing a customer acquisition, but also a customer retention strategy.
All right, so we're going to step into a brief discussion here on the types of campaigns that do or don't support this one-to-one explicit brand consent that we've been discussing. Bas, if you'll hit the next one, I think just a couple scenarios here on the types of campaigns that don't fall under this one-to-one consent flow, right? So inbound calls or click to call. These are not scenarios where the consumer would give upfront one-to-one consent to a specific brand calling them, because instead they're calling into that brand. So there's no consent gathered necessarily prior to the consumer actually placing their inbound call to the brand. Appointment scheduling is another scenario. So if you're actually taking the consumer through a web experience where you're setting up a follow-up appointment for them, where someone's going to show up at their house, and there's no phone call necessary to confirm that appointment prior to it being scheduled on the web, and then the person just showing up afterwards, that's also a scenario where you don't necessarily need this type of one-to-one brand consent to be gathered up front. And then campaigns that involve the consumer actually leaving the publisher's website page and being ultimately redirected to the brand's page where the brand gathers consent also wouldn't require this type of consent, right? So if you're running click campaigns, if you have a consumer on your site and then you're linking out to the advertisers or the brands that are buying that data and that traffic or that lead, you're not necessarily needing to gather that one-to-one consent up front on the publisher side. And then I think we touched on this throughout, but in scenarios where we're missing an S there, where the consumer isn't going to be contacted with an ATDS or text message or pre-recorded messages, and where you're scrubbing against the national DNC and the state level do not call. If you're covering off on all of that, then you may not need to gather that upfront one-to-one brand consent in order to have a compliant campaign and workflow here. On the contrary, if you flip to the next one for me, Bas, we have a couple of different campaigns and scenarios that do fit into what we've been discussing here today. So we talked about the exclusive lead workflow, which would involve that one-to-one brand consent. We talked about shared leads, where there's different possible paths for multiple brand selection, or selecting brands sequentially with their own page and their own submission of the consumer's data to that brand in the lead flow experience. That's probably the biggest impact one when we think about like the current state of shared leads and how shared leads evolve with this model. So that's where we've spent, I think, most of our time today and in our planning discussions. Call verified leads would be another category where there is a need for this one-to-one brand consent. So as the publisher who's gathering that data, or as the company that's buying that lead, in order to call on it and verify information before then selling it or transferring it and creating a transfer to a brand, you would need to have consent from the consumer to your brand. So if you're the one that's going to be placing the phone call or sending the text message to that consumer, then it's your brand that needs to be named and explicitly shown and listed to the consumer.
Eli, I thought it was interesting on the last slide as well, some of the campaigns that most likely or for sure do not require explicit brand consent. Some of those can actually be combination in certain flows, and that's a nice little leeway to the last point here that we talk about the expectation that we think that brands that have the capability to do so will focus more on shifting towards a branded experience. And we've seen that with brands that really lead categories in the last couple of years, but also brands that show really strong growth in competing with some of these 800-pound gorillas. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in the next session. And actually, ADT in particular will talk about how they've shifted from generically home security leads that they've bought historically towards way more of a branded ADT lead, which really means that the whole experience of the consumer was branded all along with ADT, from the ad, either in an email creative or on a Facebook creative, from the landing page to obviously everything that comes after that, to focus on a branded lead and what actually the implications of that have been. And going back to the slide that showed the campaigns that do not require one-to-one consent, I think there are some really innovative ways that we've seen combining some of those flows. And you obviously see a call us now button on this particular one. I think there's a lot of different flows where consumers want to be stating on how they want to interact with the brand in these days. And that can be through requesting a quote, through getting a phone call. It could be by calling in. It could be by scheduling an appointment. It could be by interacting with an e-commerce flow. And I think we'll share some really interesting, insightful stats in the next session on where this can actually be taken to, and how some of the leading companies that have disrupted this already, what they've done in order to provide the maximum results in that. I know we're running super short on time. We have 1 minute left. So unfortunately, we have so many questions that are coming in that are unanswered. We're committed to addressing some of those, definitely, and most of those in order in terms of a follow-up. We'll try to contact all of you to continue this discussion. Thank you so much for being so active during this panel. That's amazing to see. So to round it up, guys, we are planning our next session February 15th, same time, 2 p.m. Eastern. We promise you not to send an email same day that the session is tomorrow. Next time, we're going to nail our newsletter of the day off to remind you that actually the session 3 is taking place. But the next section is going to be interesting because we're going to talk about use cases on how some of these flows have already been placed and how some of these flows are constantly being tested. And also the alternative in terms of what does it mean not to be auto dialing? In the case if ATDS definition is being widened to not the definition as we know today, but just the definition of auto dialing, what does it mean to actually manual dial, and what's the impact of that? So we'll do a deep dive in that. We hope to see you all at that point of time. We'll circle back with a recording if you missed part of this session. And as I mentioned, on the questions that were posed. So thank you so much for joining today, and excited to continue this conversation with everyone that joined us on the call today. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Have a good one. Bye-bye.